When we talk about Gondor's great leaders during the War of the Ring, certain names always dominate the conversation. Aragorn, Boromir, Faramir, even Denethor. But there's one name that rarely gets the recognition it deserves. Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. A warrior, a commander, and one of Gondor's most powerful lords. He truly played a critical role in the defense of Middle-earth. Yet, despite all of his contributions, Peter Jackson's films completely erased him. Was this just a case of trimming down the cast, or did removing Imrahil fundamentally change how Gondor was portrayed in the films? Let's look at this today.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor. No matter what comes through that gate, you will stand your ground.
I'm talking about Imrahil today because if you're a fan of the Middle-earth strategy battle game, they just announced a new model for him, so it just felt right to talk about him today. And if you are a fan of MESBG, we do also have the channel of the Tabletop Alliance, where we play this game and other tabletop games if you'd be interested in checking it out. But anyway, let's get on with Imrahil. By the time of the War of the Ring, Gondor was in crisis. Denethor had succumbed to despair, Faramir was gravely wounded, and Boromir never returned from his journey north. With Minas Tirith on the brink of siege and no clear leadership, someone had to step forward to rally Gondor's defences. That man was Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Imrahil arrived in Minas Tirith just days before Sauron's forces descended, bringing 700 warriors as well as the elite Swan Knights, some of Gondor's finest fighters, providing the only true professional cavalry Gondor had in the battle. And he did not merely stand by and watch himself. When Faramir's retreat from Osgiliath turned into a desperate flight, it was Imrahil who rode out to save him, ensuring that he survived and was taken to the Houses of Healing. When Denethor succumbed to madness, locking himself away to burn Faramir alive, it was Imrahil who was initially given the command of Gondor's defences. When the Battle of the Pelennor Fields began, Imrahil was at the forefront, leading his knights in a critical cavalry charge that helped turn the tide of battle. And his leadership didn't stop there. After Denethor's death, someone had to rule Minas Tirith in Aragorn's absence. That responsibility fell to Imrahil, who, as basically the acting steward with Faramir's illness, had to govern the city. Even at the final battle, he stood on the front lines, leading Gondor's warriors in their last stand against Sauron's armies. Yet, despite playing one of the most crucial roles in Gondor's defences, as we said, he was not in the films. Instead, many of these actions were given to Gandalf, a choice that completely changed how Gondor was perceived on screen. But before we get into that, let's take a step back and just look at Dol Amroth itself. Who were these Swan Knights, and why was Imrahil's homeland so critical to Gondor's survival? Gondor's strength didn't rest solely in Minas Tirith. While the city stood as the last great stronghold of men, there was another bastion of power further south, Dol Amroth, a city of Númenórean nobility unshaken by the decay that had weakened much of Gondor. Its people were said to have elven blood, a rare trait among men, which gave them a distinctive presence, intelligence, and resilience. Even Legolas himself recognized it, stating, "That is a fair lord and a great captain of men. If Gondor has such great men still in these days of fading, great must have been its glory in the days of its rising." Imrahil epitomized this heritage. He was a towering figure, both in stature and in presence, leading one of the last great Númenórean houses that had not faded into mere legend. While Gondor relied heavily on conscripted soldiers, Dol Amroth was home to a standing force of professional warriors, those Swan Knights. These knights were among the best cavalry in Middle-earth, second only to those riders of Rohan in terms of mounted combat. Unlike most Gondorian troops, they were highly trained warriors, not just drafted in times of war. They were clad in full armour, bearing the iconic Swan motif of their prince, and they were disciplined and fearless, riding into battle with the skill and valour of Gondor's golden age. And their presence at Minas Tirith was no small thing. During that siege, while the Rohirrim's charge is of course the most famous, it was the Swan Knights who played a critical role in reinforcing the city's defences before the battle even began. On the Pelennor fields, they joined Aragorn and Eomer in that final push against Sauron's forces, breaking the last remnants of Mordor's army. But in the films, Gondor's defences are seen as weak, disorganised, and entirely reliant on outside help. First from Gandalf, then Rohan, and then Aragorn himself. But like we said, this is not true from the books. They did still have strong leaders, they did still have elite warriors, and Imrahil was one of the finest amongst them. So why were they erased from the movies? The answer lies in how Peter Jackson rewrote Gondor's story, by merging Imrahil's role into Gandalf's character instead. One of the most frustrating aspects of Imrahil's absence from Peter Jackson's movies is that his role wasn't just removed, it was absorbed into Gandalf's character. In the films, Gandalf isn't just a wise advisor, he essentially becomes Gondor's military leader, rallying the troops, strategizing the defences, and even commanding from the front lines. While this makes for a compelling cinematic presence, it fundamentally changes how Gondor is portrayed. In the books, Gondor isn't that helpless kingdom that can only be saved by outside intervention. It still has strong commanders, loyal warriors, and capable leaders, Imrahil being one of the greatest amongst them. So, what exactly was taken from Imrahil and given to Gandalf? Let's break this down. In the Return of the King film, one of Gandalf's most dramatic moments is when he rides out alone to save Faramir and his men as they flee from Osgiliath. The scene is cinematically stunning, of course. Gandalf rides through the gates, staff raised, blinding the Nazgul and forcing them away just in time to save Faramir. It's a great heroic moment. But in the books, this wasn't Gandalf's moment alone. No, he was joined by Imrahil and the Swan Knights in a coordinated effort to retrieve Faramir. When Faramir's retreat turns into a disaster, Imrahil and his knights ride out alongside Gandalf, helping to drive back the enemy to retrieve the wounded Faramir before he is completely overrun. This isn't a minor change. This moment in the books proves that Gondor wasn't defenseless without Gandalf. It had leaders willing to fight for their people, leaders like Imrahil. By making it a solo act for Gandalf, the films reinforced the idea that Gondor was directionless without him, rather than showing that it had commanders still willing to take the fight to the enemy. Then, Denethor's descent into madness is one of the most memorable moments in The Return of the King, but once again the film shifts an important moment away from Imrahil. In the movie, Gandalf is the one who confronts Denethor, essentially taking control of the city's defense by force when the steward refuses to lead. But again, in the book, before Gandalf even acts, it's Imrahil who steps forward and assumes command of Gondor's forces. When Denethor refuses to lead, Imrahil takes charge of the defense, rallying the city's warriors and ensuring that Minas Tirith doesn't crumble before the battle even begins. Even more striking is that in the books, it is Imrahil, not Gandalf, who first realizes that Faramir is alive. He is not yet dead, and I order you not to slay him. This declaration forces Denethor's servants to hesitate, preventing them from setting fire to Faramir while he still breathes. This was a moment of decisive leadership from Imrahil, but again in the film, it's Gandalf who takes this role instead. Of course, Gandalf does ultimately intervene to stop Denethor from dragging Faramir onto the pyre with him, but the film removes Imrahil's key role in the confrontation. This change makes Gandalf appear as the sole voice yet again in Minas Tirith, when in reality, Imrahil was just as competent and commanding. And also in the movies, Gondor's defences are portrayed as weak and leaderless, with only Gandalf standing between the city and total collapse. At the gates of Minas Tirith, Gandalf alone is shown rallying the soldiers, keeping them from fleeing in terror. His presence is powerful, and visually, it makes him appear as the only thing standing in Sauron's way. But in the books, while Gandalf does take a stand at the gates against the Witch King, Imrahil actively leads troops elsewhere, ensuring the city's defences held together. He wasn't just sitting inside the city waiting for Gandalf to act, he was commanding Gondor's best trained warriors, keeping order among the defenders, and fighting in the trenches himself. Once Minas Tirith was secured after the battle, someone had to be in charge, and well, that fell to Prince Imrahil immediately. With Faramir's injuries, he was almost acting steward, if you will. Again, although he passed this power on, it shows that he was the first person they turned to. Aragorn himself entrusted the city to him, knowing that he was one of Gondor's most competent leaders. Yet, in the films, Minas Tirith is left without any clear leadership once the battle ends, with no mention of Imrahil being entrusted in any way. There's no moment of showing that he temporarily ruled in Faramir's absence, no indication that the city had a stabilizing force that he insisted upon while another army marched to the Black Gate. This omission reinforces the flawed portrayal of Gondor as a kingdom without direction, when in reality, those strong leaders were there. By removing this aspect of Imrahil's story, the film undercuts Gondor's resilience, making it feel as if Aragorn was truly the only hope for their survival. And there's also one more smaller thing that he did in the movies that was changed, but this one wasn't necessarily for the worst. It was Imrahil who noticed that Éowyn was still alive as well. However, this moment in the movies was given to Éomer, and I do actually agree that that was one of the good changes, as having her brother find her was definitely a very emotional moment. It was such a shame it was only seen in the extended cuts. But anyway, as for all these changes, they weren't just small adjustments. They fundamentally changed how Gondor was presented. Instead of a kingdom fighting to survive, Gondor is portrayed as completely leaderless without Gandalf's intervention. Instead of Imrahil standing as one of Gondor's greatest warriors, he doesn't even exist. Instead of Gondor's soldiers fighting alongside its nobility, they are shown desperate and broken. It really does make a huge difference in how they're perceived. Gondor is not a dying kingdom in need of a savior. It is a land filled with powerful warriors and noble leaders, some of whom stood against Sauron without the guidance of wizards or kings. And well, Prince Imrahil, he was one of them. But in the films, he is gone without a trace. After looking at this, you kind of realize Gondor's strength during the War of the Ring wasn't just in its walls or armies. Like I said, the leaders were there. But many people will go, well, what about Boromir and Faramir, the sons of the steward Denethor? Well, how did he compare to Boromir and Faramir? Was he just another noble lord? Or was he actually Gondor's greatest leader? I think it could be fun to have a look at this. Boromir was a force of nature, a warrior first, a commander second. He was one of the most physically imposing fighters in the entire Lord of the Rings, leading Gondor's armies with bravery and brute force. He was fearless in battle, charismatic, and had a Gondor first mentality. But one of his greatest strengths was also one of his greatest weaknesses. His pride and desperation made him short-sighted. He believed that strength alone would protect Gondor, and that is why he had so many issues when it came to the One Ring. He saw it as that ultimate weapon that could really turn the tide. But then what about Faramir? After all, he was Boromir's polar opposite. Where Boromir saw strength as Gondor's greatest weapon, Faramir, well, he saw wisdom. He was a master tactician. He rejected the ring. He had a deep understanding of history, but you also have to say, his greatest strength was also his weakness as well. He lacked his brother's presence. He was filled with self-doubt from Denethor, and it's fair to say he was too cautious at times. Faramir was a brilliant commander, but he was held back by Denethor's constant disapproval. His need to prove himself often led him to doubt his own decisions, which is why he ultimately obeyed Denethor's suicidal order to retake Osgiliath. And then we have Prince Imrahil. Unlike Boromir and Faramir, he wasn't just a commander in Gondor's military. He was the ruler, the general, and the leader with decades of experience. He had Boromir's martial strength, he had Faramir's intelligence, and then he had something neither of them had: absolute authority over his people. Boromir was an inspirational leader, but he lacked the patience for long-term rule. Faramir was a wise leader, but he lacked the confidence to command outright. Imrahil, he was the perfect balance between the two, a leader who could think strategically and lead them from the front lines. Had he been the one to go to Rivendell, would he end up trying to take the ring? Doubtful. Had he already been at Minas Tirith, would he have led a doomed charge to retake Osgiliath? No chance. Imrahil was the leader Gondor needed. The warrior without blind ambition, the ruler without insecurity, the commander whose strength never wavered. Gondor was lucky to have all of these men, but in the final days of the Third Age, it was Imrahil who stood unshaken. So there we have it. Prince Imrahil was more than just a noble from a fiefdom of Gondor. He was a commander, a ruler, and perhaps Gondor's greatest unsung hero. While he was respected in the books, his role was still overshadowed by the stewards, the fellowship, and Rohan's warriors as well. And in the films, he was just left out entirely. But had he been more involved? Had he taken Boromir's place at the Council of Elrond, or Denethor's place as Gondor's leader, or even Aragorn's place leading the final charge against Sauron? Who knows how different things may have been. At the very least, Gondor could have had a brighter future even before Aragorn's return. And now it is your turn. Was Prince Imrahil the leader Gondor truly needed? Or because he's one of my favourite characters, do I perhaps consider him a greater character than he truly is? Share your thoughts in the comments down below. And along with this, if you would like to support the channel in other ways, please consider our Patreon. You can't always rely on YouTube itself, so this extra support will really help the channel stay strong and keep us getting that content out for you. But with that, thank you for spending just some of your time with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.